ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Nick and Joe Show. I am Joe. He is Nick, and sitting kind of beside Nick and across from me is our good friend Chris Fraser.
He makes the third leg of the triangle.
The third leg of the stool?
The triad.
The triad.
That's what we could call it, the triad.
There you go.
Okay.
Wow.
Just a
genius.
Okay, just let's not get too carried away with this, because remember, we have been subjected to some degree of criticism from some of our listeners on the podcast about spending far too much time
being
kibitzing and joking around and having fun. So if you're a regular listener, you probably noticed that we've been very serious in this week's episode. If you haven't checked out parts 1, 2, and 3,
you missed.
But you can always go back and check them out.
That's why we do podcasts.
That's right. And you can tell your friends and neighbors about us.
Please.
Yeah.
Especially the ones who you don't think would like us.
That's right, because we want to get under their skin.
We want converts.
That's right.
Can I get an amen?
I didn't think you Catholics evangelized that much,
Can I get an amen?
An A woman.
Yeah,
no,
that's right.
no.
Don't go there.
No. I'm old school. It's amen. A woman.
Okay. Well, we were having some difficulty deciding what we wanted to talk about in this final segment of this week's show. And I'm not going to tell you what we decided not to talk about, because we're going to put that off to a future show. It's not time sensitive. But we did want to get into this whole thing this week. I think it's more timely, and that is what's happening in Texas. And, if you're listening to the podcast, you're listening to us a few days after the big deep freeze and snow hit Texas and much of the southern and United States and Midwest. So, it could be sunny and warm there today while you're listening to the podcast. But when we were doing the show, the live show, it was cold and snowy there. Of course, it's cold and snowy here, too. But it's always cold and snowy here in February.
I was going to say, their definition of cold and snowy is completely different than ours.
Yes, I think it's like
2 degrees Celsius.
It's 2 degrees Celsius.
That's like 34 for people who actually pay attention to what temperatures really should be.
Actually, it's even warmer. It's like 35 or 36 degrees.
See, now you're talking English.
Okay. But you could die eventually, you can die of exposure at that kind of temperature.
Oh, there are people down there who are... I heard one guy in the news say, I left my house to go outside to get warm because it was too cold in the house.
Yeah.
Well, the thing about this that blows me away, first of all, for you and I, we're used to that kind of cold. Now, shut the power off when it's around the freezing mark, no matter what scale you use. That's going to have an effect.
Yeah.
And you're going to have to adjust to that. Mm-hmm. But living where we are, we could handle it better than our southern cousins could. In Texas, they don't have a lot of wood stoves in their houses. They don't have a lot of... they may have backup generators, I don't know, to run the house on should they have a power failure. But I think that what we're looking at here is a scenario where you've got old infrastructure. You've got how the infrastructure can handle air conditioners in the summertime. Because in Texas, in summertime, it gets hot. Yeah. I could not live in Texas in the summertime. It would take me a long time to acclimatize.
It depends on where. It's the weather up in northern Texas is not that bad, and it's a lot drier.
Okay.
Anyway,
let's say Dallas-Fort Worth. Pick the middle of the state.
But Nick, in the summertime... Okay, you could turn your air conditioner off, and you're going to be very hot, sweaty. But, that's different. Being 5 or 6 degrees hotter than normal is not the same thing as being 10 or 15 degrees colder than normal. Yeah, so I'm not speaking from an energy consumption point of view here, but I do think it's fair to say that when your electrical grid, when your power supply grid fails in freezing temperatures, that's much more of an emergency, I think, than if it's failing in the summer months.
Yeah, I agree with you.
But the real issue here, okay, to just jump in with both feet, okay? The real issue here is, regardless of the reasons why the power grid has failed so miserably and so generally in Texas, whether it's poor maintenance, aging infrastructure, or, as you were saying, just overtaxing it from charging electric cars. You were saying that there's some people have been saying that.
A lot of the problem, yeah.
Whatever the reason, okay, the fact is that the conventional hydro generation has not been able to compensate for the lack of generating power of the wind turbines
and solar
panels, which are not contributing at all in this weather. So you have turbines that are frozen, and you have solar power panels
that are covered
in snow, and they're not generating electricity. So there are two issues here. One is the state of the infrastructure, okay, for better or worse. But the second one is the lack of any kind of capacity, any kind of generating capacity from these from solar power or from wind turbines. So even if you had the grid was up and nobody was suffering, there was no problem, pristine condition, everybody's got adequate heat, adequate electricity, and everyone who drives a Tesla can charge it to their heart's content, okay, without quickly running down the battery because of the cold weather. Even if that was the case, the problem would still exist that for all of the millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars that's been invested in so-called clean energy, it's still not contributing. It still wouldn't be contributing any kind of generating capacity to the grid. And I think that's a massive, massive failure of the green energy policy, not just in the United States, but everywhere.
You know what? You're absolutely correct on that. And this is, as I think you mentioned, Tucker Carlson said, this is what happens when you try to convert over to green energy.
Too fast, yeah.
Or I would argue even at all. First, we have an abundance of fossil fuel. Why don't we use it? Oh, I know, because, we all know the reasons. But when you have...
Well, I don't know the reasons.
Well, the reasons
I'm not asking you to explain it to me. I just wanted to make it clear to our listeners that Nick might think he knows the reasons why we shouldn't.
Well, I think most people know why there's a move on to try to step away from fossil fuels. And that's to save the planet, right, in a generic sense.
Right.
Well, it's utter nonsense. But that doesn't matter. See, one of the things that as conservatives we make a fundamental mistake, and the left feeds on it. That is, we try to use logic, common sense, and reason to debate with emotion. And every time you try that, you are beat before you start. Because the emotional person doesn't want to hear common sense, logic, and reason. They want to be supported in their emotional outburst. Okay, it's like a teenager. No, you can't have the car tonight. But I want the car tonight. I got to fix the brakes. But they worked when I came home. You can't have... It doesn't matter the fact that the brakes don't work. They're now emotionally invested in this, and there's nothing you can say to them to cross that it's going to get it through their head. I'm just using this as one of a billion examples that is going to make them say, well, I guess you're right. Some would, but for the most part, when you have a group of people this heavily invested with emotional and political and financial capital in an agenda, they will rather chew broken glass and razor blades than admit that agenda is flawed. And we, trying to use common sense, logic, and reason to point it out, we're going to lose that argument. We're going to lose those people every single time.
Yeah, and they had the wildfires in California, which is not unusual. It happens almost every summer. But how many people, we started to hear the term forest management, and actually President Trump brought that up last year. Of course, if Trump says it, then people
know
tune
it's
out.
bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But forest management is a thing. I never knew that years ago. I never heard anybody talk about forest management, but there is such a thing as forest management, and it makes a difference. It can make the difference between half your state burning up. But, yeah, people get emotions. Oh, climate change, you see what's happening? So it's like, that's not because of climate change. It could actually be because of bad forest management
practices.
But when you try to explain that to people, they don't want to hear it.
No, I know, and that's what I mean by they get invested, and it doesn't matter. Like David Suzuki, take him as an example. He is so heavily invested in this whole climate change nonsense, global warming nonsense, that for him to come out and say, I was wrong, is an impossibility. He will never say that. It doesn't matter what the science says. It doesn't matter what the facts say. He will never admit that he was wrong. He will go to his grave swearing up and down that it's mankind's fault, and therefore he was right.
I was actually at a seminar where David Suzuki was the guest speaker. This was about 6 or 7 years ago.
That must have been painful.
And I was one of the ushers at this thing. And a guy at the back, when it came to the question and answer period, a gentleman not too far from me got up and he went to the microphone and asked Dr. Suzuki, you keep on talking about climate change is caused by the activities of mankind today. And he says, how do you explain climate change like 200 or 300 years ago? And Dr. Suzuki just went ballistic on the guy, saying, oh, you climate deniers and blah, 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 blah.
Yep.
I was shocked at his answer, his response. I thought, why are you getting angry? The guy is asking a legitimate country. And Suzuki just lost it, and I couldn't believe it. I feel embarrassed for the guy who asked the question.
Well, David Suzuki has a bit of a temper.
Well, see, now the way to do that is have the next guy over the far microphone say, Mr. Suzuki, I have a question, but first I want to hear the answer to that guy's.
Yeah. He didn't answer the question. He just got angry.
That's right, because he couldn't answer the question. Yeah. And that's what I mean about emotional capitalism, or emotional capital built into a position. And when you get that siege mentality where you think the whole world's against you and that you have staked a claim on a piece of ground, even if it's on quicksand, you will go down in the quicksand rather than admit you're standing on quicksand.
Now, the situation, though, in Texas, that's an unusual situation. They don't get weather like this. This is very,
no one has ever denied the climate's changing. It's just why. That's what the argument should be.
Well, and I would be really careful about using terms like they never get weather like this. In our experience,
it gets cool, but this is really
in our
experience.
I don't know what it was like 500 years ago or 600 years ago. None of us do, and so this is part of the problem. There's a certain amount of hubris in the whole climate change, man-made climate change argument, and the idea that if the climate is changing, and I concede, I'm prepared to concede the climate changes.
I think it does.
So I'm not a climate change denier by any stretch of the imagination, but there's this arrogance, if you will, sort of built into the notion that when the climate changes, it must be because of us. Okay? Well, it must be because of us. We're human beings. We control everything. Well, the uncomfortable fact is, going back to what we were talking about in the first segment, if you want to go back and listen to that in the podcast, ladies and gentlemen, and that is that the world is not really a fair place.
No.
And so, guess what? The climate changes. And there are consequences to the climate changing, and it may change quickly, it may change slowly. And historically, I don't know what the speed, what is the average speed, okay? What is